What if I told you that while the world was celebrating Da Vinci's sketches and Columbus's compass, there was another world, breathing, building, dreaming, completely left out of the storybooks? The year is 1490. Europe is ablaze with curiosity. Artists paint with purpose. Kings play games of power, and ships whisper of new worlds across the sea. In Spain, a queen prepares to gamble the future on a sailor named Columbus. In Florence, scholars dust off the bones of ancient Greece, and in the icy silence of maps drawn by candlelight, Africa is simply a void. No names, no cities, no people, just emptiness. But that silence, that blank space, it was a lie, a deliberate one. Because while Europe looked outward for greatness, Africa had already found hers within. Long before the chains, before the colonizers, before the world was split into conquerors and conquered, Africa was writing its own story in stone, bronze, blood, and brilliance. In the sweltering Sahel, the Songhai Empire towered over trade routes like a god watching rivers. To the south, in dense equatorial forests, the Kingdom of Congo moved to the rhythm of ritual and royalty. But further west, nestled near the Gulf of Guinea, rose a city so advanced it should have been on every child's history test. Yet most never hear its name: Benin. Not the modern-day country, no. We're talking about a kingdom, a powerhouse of precision, diplomacy, and art. In the heart of it stood the Oba's palace, crafted not of mere brick or clay, but coral stone and bronze. Its walls, they say, stretch farther than those of any European castle. Its streets were aligned with mathematical brilliance, laid out long before city planning had a name. Benin was not tribal, it was architectural, sophisticated, sovereign. While Columbus was still chasing shadows on the ocean, Benin had already mastered metallurgy. Its bronze plaques told stories more vivid than any European manuscript. Each cast a testament to a people who recorded their own history with their own hands. And here's something that will shake your understanding. When Portuguese explorers first arrived in Benin, they didn't see chaos or savagery. They saw a city that rivaled Lisbon. They saw order, they saw protocol, they saw greatness. Yet today, silence. Why? Because what doesn't fit the myth gets erased. But not here, not on Folktales Cinema. Welcome to Folktales Cinema, where forgotten legends are reborn in the light. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard far and wide, shared in classrooms, remembered at dinner tables, whispered through generations, then now's the time to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Stories drop every week, but this might change the way you see everything. Let's pull back the curtain. Today we remember not just the rise of Benin, but the moment before the fall, the calm before foreign ships darkened the horizon. This is not a fairy tale. It is legacy, bloodline, resistance, and resilience carved in coral and flame. And so I ask you, why do you think this story was hidden for so long? What happens to a world when its past is stolen, renamed, rewritten? Let me know in the comments. Your voice matters here. Together, we're not just reviving old stories, we're challenging the silence. And if this resonates with you, if you feel the weight of these lost histories pressing against the present, then share this video. Be the voice that makes sure stories like these echo beyond algorithms, beyond borders. Because stories like this don't just inform, they awaken. This is Folktales Cinema, and now we begin. Today, many are beginning to accept what traditional textbooks have long ignored. Christopher Columbus was far from the first to sail across the Atlantic. Centuries before his fabled 1492 voyage, other civilizations had already touched distant shores. The Norse explorers, the Polynesian navigators, even the Chinese mariners, all left whispers of journeys across oceans long before European empires raised their flags. But amid all this newfound acceptance, one possibility still remains buried in silence. That Africans too may have made their way across the Atlantic, not in chains, but in command. This story is not a myth. It's not a romanticized folktale. It's a chapter history never finished. Maybe because someone didn't want it told. This is the story of Abu Bakari II, the ninth Mansa of the Mali Empire. And if what the records and oral accounts suggest is true, Then nearly 200 years before Columbus set his eyes westward, an African emperor launched one of the most ambitious maritime explorations the world had ever seen. Let's travel back to a time when Mali was one of the richest and most powerful empires on earth. The golden age of Timbuktu, the era of mathematicians, astronomers, poets, and engineers. Mali wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And its emperors weren't just rulers, they were visionaries. Among them stood Bakari II. He was no ordinary king. In the heart of West Africa, surrounded by scholars and wealth, Bakari became obsessed with one question: where did the great ocean end? According to medieval accounts, especially those recorded by the 14th century Arab Egyptian scholar Shihab al-Umari, this wasn't some wild legend passed down through rumor. It was historical testimony gathered firsthand. During Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, al-Umari questioned him about his succession to the throne. Musa's answer was simple but profound. He said, "The ruler before me did not believe that the ocean which encircles the earth had no end. He was determined to discover its limit. So he prepared a grand fleet, 200 ships filled with men, and 200 more carrying gold, food, and water for long-term survival. He instructed them not to return until they had reached the far edge of the sea or until they had no supplies left. Only one ship ever came back. The captain of that lone vessel told a haunting story. As the fleet sailed far beyond the known world, they came upon a powerful current in the open ocean. Ship after ship was swallowed by it. The captain turned back, defying the orders of the emperor. But Bakari was not discouraged. Instead, he doubled down. He relinquished the throne of one of the wealthiest empires on earth, handed power to Mansa Musa, and chose to lead the second expedition himself. This time, he is believed to have set out with 2,000 ships. Think about that. An emperor, a ruler with unimaginable power, giving up his throne not for war, not for wealth, but to seek knowledge, to explore, to understand what lay beyond the horizon. The fate of that second voyage has been lost to time. No ship returned to tell the tale. No surviving chronicle explains what they found, but legends linger and clues remain. Some historians point to West African symbols and architectural similarities found in pre-Columbian sites across South America and the Caribbean. Others highlight the accounts of early European colonizers who described finding native tribes who spoke of black-skinned visitors arriving long before the Spanish. Skeptical? Of course. But silence in the archives doesn't mean silence in truth. And here's where the story darkens. Why was this story buried? Why was a narrative so grand, so bold, allowed to fade into the background? Because it challenges the timeline of conquest. Because it disrupts the myth that Africans were only ever slaves, never explorers. That Africa only entered world history in chains, never in command. The captain of the lone returning ship was a broken man. Summoned before the court, he recounted a vision more surreal than storm or sea monster. He spoke of a place deep in the ocean where the waters themselves seemed alive. A powerful current, not visible at first, but unstoppable once it took hold. One by one, the ships ahead of him were sucked into a vast, churning whirlpool. He watched in horror as mass vanished into the misty spray, swallowed whole by a force he couldn't explain. Somehow, by a twist of fate or divine mercy, his ship had been spared. He turned back, trembling, the cries of the lost fleet echoing in his mind. But Bakari was undeterred. He listened. He understood. And he made his decision. He would go himself. He did the unthinkable, the unimaginable. He abdicated his throne, handed over the seat of the Mali Empire, one of the most powerful kingdoms on earth, to Mansa Musa, and began assembling an expedition that would eclipse the first in scale and ambition. 2,000 ships. 1,000 carrying the bravest sailors, scholars, warriors, and navigators his empire had to offer. 1,000 more packed supplies. Food, water, livestock, seeds, cloth, gold, instruments of science and religion, and scrolls of knowledge from Timbuktu. This was not a madman's voyage. This was a floating civilization, prepared to establish a new home across an unknown sea. And so, Sometime around 1311 CE, Mansa Abu Bakari II sailed westward into legend. He was never seen again. For generations, the fate of his fleet has remained one of history's great mysteries. But fragments of evidence, scattered across centuries and continents, whisper that the journey may not have ended in tragedy. Centuries later, Christopher Columbus himself wrote something odd in his journal during his third voyage. He noted that one of his goals was to investigate reports that African sailors had been seen venturing west from the coast of Guinea. He spoke of rumors, tales he couldn't quite prove but couldn't ignore, that dark-skinned traders had been spotted in the Caribbean long before his own arrival. On the island of Hispaniola, the local Taino people told of visitors who came from the south and southeast, arriving in large canoes. These strangers carried weapons, spears tipped with a strange metal they called guanin. European explorers later tested this metal and were stunned. It matched the precise alloy composition of West African metallurgy, an expertly crafted blend of gold, silver, and copper. Is it possible? Could some of Abu Bakari's fleet have made landfall in the Caribbean or even South America? Let's look at the larger context. By 1492, Spain had just emerged from over 700 years of Moorish rule. The Reconquista was complete, but the influence of the Moors, Muslims of North African descent, remained deep in Iberian soil. They had brought architecture, medicine, poetry, astronomy, mathematics, and seafaring technology. The compasses, astrolabes, star charts, and ships Columbus used were not born in a vacuum. They were fruits of Arab and African science, cultivated during centuries of Islamic Golden Age scholarship. So what if Columbus wasn't just inspired by Marco Polo's tales of the East, but also by stories of African explorers who had already gone west? If true, then the myth of European exclusivity in exploration begins to crumble. And this brings us back to Abu Bakari's homeland. While the emperor vanished into the Atlantic, the Mali Empire did not. In the 1400s, Mali remained a beacon of prosperity and learning. The empire stretched across present-day Mali, Senegal, Guinea, and beyond. At its heart stood Niani, the capital, nestled along the banks of the Niger River like a jewel in the crown of West Africa. Its administration was no less sophisticated than its European counterparts. Provincial governors, tax collectors, and judges worked under an imperial system that balanced power through consultation and law. Markets overflowed with goods, salt from the north, gold from the south, manuscripts from the east. And then there was Timbuktu. To many in the modern West, the word sounds mythical, used to describe some far-off, imaginary place. But in the 15th century, Timbuktu was as real as Rome or Paris, and possibly more important. It was home to Sankore University, one of the greatest centers of learning in the Islamic world. With over 25,000 students and hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, its scholars wrote, debated, and taught in medicine, astronomy, theology, philosophy, mathematics, law, and grammar. They recorded histories of kings, the movements of planets, and the healing properties of herbs. And they did so in Arabic, Fula, Soninke, and native man tongues. Manuscripts from Timbuktu would eventually be hidden in desert caves and passed down secretly through generations to protect them from fire, conquest, and time. Today, they are proof of an African intellectual tradition that predates colonial influence by centuries. Meanwhile, in Jenny, another city of gold and learning, mud brick architecture soared skyward, and scholars gathered in the Great Mosque, one of the architectural marvels of the pre-modern world. Trade routes snaked across the Sahara, linking Mali to Cairo, Mecca, and Marrakesh. So while Europe struggled through feudal wars and religious schisms, Mali was mapping stars, performing surgeries, and debating the ethics of leadership. It was not a dark continent. It was a continent of light. And Abu Bakari, he was its flame bearer. Maybe he and his fleet reached the Americas and planted seeds of a forgotten contact. Maybe they were lost at sea, their bones mingling with coral on the ocean floor. Or maybe, just maybe, they made it, but left no record, blending into the fabric of native cultures, lost in translation. This is not fantasy. This is history knocking on the door, asking to be let back in. And it makes you wonder, What other chapters have we been told not to read? To be a scholar in the Empire of Mali during the height of its golden age was to be revered, truly revered. Knowledge wasn't just admired, it was worshipped. Books were considered more valuable than gold, and the minds that created and copied them were held in the highest esteem. In the Empire of Mansa Musa, intellect was a currency, and scholars were its wealthiest citizens. So the next time someone questions whether Africa had writing, or suggests that Africans lived without books or universities, tell them about Timbuktu. Tell them about Gao. Tell them about Jen. Long before Gutenberg printed his first Bible in Europe, African scribes were hunched over manuscripts under oil lamps, copying pages of law, medicine, astronomy, theology, and poetry. These manuscripts traveled across deserts and through cities, exchanged like treasures among scholars who debated their contents in open courtyards and quiet libraries. Timbuktu alone held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts tucked away in private collections and madrasas. Families guarded them like sacred relics, passing them down through generations. The ink may have faded with time, but the words remain powerful. But Mali wasn't just a land of thinkers. It was a trade empire, pulsing with movement and transaction. Caravans crossed the Sahara with camels laden with salt blocks, gold dust, kola nuts, and fine cloth. These were exchanged with Berber merchants, Egyptian traders, Tunisian dealers, and even Venetian explorers. Mali controlled the arteries of trans-Saharan commerce, a strategic advantage that brought incredible wealth and influence. Gold from the southern forests of Bambouk flowed north. Salt from the Sahara came south. Ivory, spices, textiles, and metals passed through the empire's cities like blood through veins. Every market hummed with conversation in dozens of languages. The world came to Mali, not the other way around. Yet this empire was more than the sum of its goods and knowledge. It was deeply spiritual. Islam had found fertile ground in Mali, spreading peacefully through trade, diplomacy, and scholarship. Great mosques rose from the earth like promises, but the old ways did not disappear. Traditional African beliefs lived alongside Islam, blending into a unique spiritual mosaic. Tolerance wasn't just a virtue, it was a way of life. The emperor wasn't merely a ruler of land and laws. He was also seen as a spiritual custodian, responsible for the moral and physical welfare of his people. His court included not only governors and generals, but also imams, griots, and diviners. Statecraft and soulcraft walked hand in hand. And women? They were not silenced or hidden away. Historical records, including accounts from North African and Arab travelers, speak of women participating in markets, managing estates, engaging in intellectual life, and even influencing political decisions. They owned property, they spoke with authority. They lived as full citizens in a world that was, for many others, centuries away from such freedoms. This was Mali, a world of kings and queens, traders and teachers, a place where empires weren't built with chains, but with ideas. A civilization that shatters the tired narrative of a dark continent waiting to be discovered. Mali was the light others sought. But Mali was not alone. As we journey further across the continent, we find other beacons glowing in the darkness of forgotten history. Let us now head south, beyond the deserts, beyond the savannas, into the misty highlands of present-day Zimbabwe, where a different kind of majesty rose from the earth, stone by stone. This is the story of Great Zimbabwe, a civilization so mysterious, so enduring, that even its ruins whisper secrets to those who stand among them. In the 1400s, while Mali thrived in the west, Great Zimbabwe reached its own peak, a powerful urban society with a population of nearly 20,000 people. That number might seem modest by today's standards, but in the pre-modern world, it was monumental. Great Zimbabwe was one of the largest and most complex cities in sub-Saharan Africa. Its name comes from the Shona language, Zimba Rimabwe, House of Stone, and that's exactly what it was. Monumental stone architecture, meticulously stacked without mortar, held strong through centuries of wind and rain. No mud, no thatch, just granite blocks arranged with such precision that engineers today still marvel at how it was done. The Great Enclosure, Zimbabwe's most iconic structure, stretches over 250 meters in circumference. Some of its walls tower over 11 meters high. Within its bounds are conical towers, narrow passageways, and remnants of ceremonial sites. But what makes it even more extraordinary is this. It was built entirely by African hands. For decades, colonial historians insisted it must have been built by foreigners. They refused to believe that black Africans could have constructed such magnificence. But archaeology tells a different story. Carbon dating, artifact analysis, and oral tradition all confirm the truth. Great Zimbabwe was designed, engineered, and built by indigenous Africans. And it wasn't just a city of stone, it was a hub of international trade. Situated between the goldfields inland and the trading ports along the Swahili coast, Great Zimbabwe thrived as a middleman in a global economy. From the mines, gold flowed to the city, and from the city it journeyed eastward toward the coast, where it was traded with Arab, Persian, Indian, and Chinese merchants. Archaeologists have uncovered astonishing artifacts: Chinese porcelain, Persian glassware, Arab coins, Indian beads. These were not isolated people. They were deeply connected to the world's trade routes, not as passive suppliers, but as savvy negotiators. The people of Great Zimbabwe were more than traders. They were also artists. They refined gold into intricate jewelry. They crafted ceremonial items. They managed cattle herds, grew crops, and built thriving communities that balanced agriculture with commerce. This was not an isolated kingdom. It was part of a web stretching from the African interior to the Indian Ocean and beyond. And it challenges everything we've been taught about Africa, because it shows that Africa was not waiting to be discovered. It was already present, already powerful, already sophisticated. So the next time you hear someone claim that Africa had no civilizations, no trade, no writing, no architecture, think of Mali. Think of Great Zimbabwe. Think of the scholars who debated under the stars and the builders who carved cities from stone. Their legacy isn't a myth, it's history, and it's time the world remembered it. We must ask, how did Chinese porcelain end up here? How did Arab coins find their way to the heart of Zimbabwe? The answer isn't mysterious, it's revealing. Africans were not isolated from the world. They were already deeply engaged in it. Great Zimbabwe's people, likely of the Rose V or Gokomera cultures, governed not through chaos or tribal disarray, but through structured political systems. Their kings weren't just rulers. They were spiritual leaders, believed to be chosen by the ancestors, mediators between the mortal and divine. Their words shaped not only trade routes, but religious rituals, agricultural patterns, and cosmic balance. And women? They were not sidelined. They traded in markets, presided over rituals, and were heads of households. They shaped the economy and the soul of society, just as surely as the men who ruled from thrones of carved stone. So what happened? Why was Great Zimbabwe abandoned? By the late 1400s into the early 1500s, pressure began to mount. Overpopulation strained resources. The land could no longer support the growing demand for agriculture. The soils, overworked and underrested, lost their strength. Simultaneously, the bustling trade routes that once fed the city's wealth began to shift. New centers rose along the Swahili coast, and global commerce found new paths. Great Zimbabwe's fall wasn't sudden. It was a slow exhale, a quiet decline, but its memory endured. Oral traditions passed down stories of its greatness. Its architecture, those silent, enduring walls, stood as testimony. And yet, when European colonists stumbled upon the ruins centuries later, they refused to believe that Africans had built such sophistication. They invented wild myths, Phoenicians, Arabs, even lost tribes of Israel. Anyone but Africans. Why? Because they couldn't believe it. Or rather, they didn't want to. But we know better now, and here on Folktales Cinema, we do not forget, we remember. Great Zimbabwe was not some forgotten corner. It was the heart of innovation, dignity, and pride in southern Africa. But as the inland stone giants began to fall silent, the coastline began to hum with a different kind of song, one carried on sea breezes, sung in many tongues, and written in coral stone. Now we turn east, along the golden coastlines of today's Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and Somalia. Here, where waves kiss the sand, African kingdoms gazed across the sea not with fear, but with ambition. Welcome to the Swahili city-states. They weren't villages, they were cities, cosmopolitan, elegant, powerful. Kilwa, Zanzibar, Mombasa, Malindi, Sofala, names that today might seem tucked into textbooks, but in the 1400s, they were bustling centers of global commerce, culture, and diplomacy. Let's begin with Kilwa Kisiwani, present-day Tanzania. At its peak, Kilwa controlled gold routes reaching deep into the continent. From great Zimbabwe's mines, across rivers and overland trails, gold, ivory, and captives flowed toward Kilwa's port. And from there, out into the world. In return came Persian glass, Indian cotton, Chinese porcelain, and Arabian incense. Kilwa's rulers constructed coral stone palaces, built vast marketplaces, and commissioned one of Africa's oldest mosques, an architectural marvel still standing today. When Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama arrived at Kilwa in the late 1400s, he wrote not of savagery, but of sophistication. He saw paved streets, luxurious homes, and a people deeply embedded in global trade. Swahili, the language spoken across the coast, was itself a map of connections, a Bantu foundation layered with Arabic, Persian, and Indian vocabulary. Cultures didn't clash, they merged. Marriage, diplomacy, and business bonded Africans to the wider world. Islam had spread here not through sword, but through trust, trade, and mutual respect. The ruling classes, merchants, scholars, they were Black Africans, many of whom had married across cultures without ever abandoning their own identities. Kilwa was just one gem, and in Zanzibar, spice-laden winds carried the aroma of cloves across the ocean. In Mombasa, naval power and bustling harbors made it a mercantile force. Malindi opened its gates to Chinese fleets under Admiral Zheng He, welcoming them with ceremony and trade. Sofala became the southern jewel, ferrying gold from the interior across the Indian Ocean. These city-states had courts, laws, merchant guilds, diplomacy. Women traded, women ruled homes, women inherited property and managed wealth. This was African agency in motion. But by the late 1400s, dark winds gathered. The Portuguese, new to oceanic power, armed with cannons and imperial ambition, began their push. They weren't just seeking spice, they were hunting domination. But remember, before the warships, before the violence, the Swahili coast stood as a testament to Black brilliance, cultural openness, and self-determined trade. Now, journey inward. To Central Africa, to a kingdom that rose like a heartbeat in the jungle, the Kingdom of Congo. What would become modern-day Angola, parts of Congo, Brazzaville, and DRC, once bowed to the Manicongo, the King of Congo. His court wasn't tribal, it was organized, hierarchical, and diplomatic. The capital, Mbanza, Congo, was a city of planned streets, royal courts, and administrative buildings. Nobles held seats in councils. Laws were documented, taxes were collected. Disputes were resolved in layered courts. It was a kingdom in every true sense of the word. Trade boomed. Copper, raffia cloth, salt, pottery, ivory. It flowed through the kingdom's veins. Blacksmiths shaped tools and weapons. Weavers crafted art and garments. Farmers cultivated rich lands. And from the interior to the coast, trade routes buzzed. When the Portuguese first arrived in 1483, they found not a land to conquer, but a kingdom to negotiate with. King Zinga Nkuu, wise and curious, welcomed the envoys. He forged alliances, traded goods, and opened a cautious door to European missionaries. His son, Mvemba and Zinga, would become Afonso I, the Christian king of Africa. But Afonso was no puppet. He used Christianity strategically, building schools, promoting law, strengthening central authority. He embraced the new, but never abandoned the old. Yet even as he wrote letters to European kings, pleading against illegal slave trade and corruption, the tide was turning. What began as alliance soon soured into exploitation. Foreign greed poisoned Congo's court. Slave raids, corruption, betrayal, all began to take root. Still, the Kingdom of Congo remained a force for over 3 centuries. Its legacy, written in stone and spirit, cannot be erased. When they say Africa had no kingdoms, no laws, no government, say Mbanza Congo, say Mana Congo, say history. And now, from central to west, we meet the forest-shrouded brilliance of Benin. In the lush heart of today's Nigeria rose a city so organized, so rich in art, that when Europeans first saw it, they doubted their own eyes. This was Benin. In the 1400s, under Oba Ewar the Great, Benin exploded into a golden age. Ewar wasn't just a king, he was a builder, a warrior, a spiritual innovator. He redesigned Benin City, transforming it into an urban masterpiece. Broad streets, moats and walls stretching over 16,000 kilometers, longer than the Great Wall of China. Yes, built by black hands. Homes followed urban plans. Neighborhoods had zoning. Public spaces were maintained. At the heart was the royal palace, so grand that Portuguese sailors compared it to Lisbon. But Benin's true soul beat in its art. Bronze plaques, ivory carvings, lost wax castings, so intricate they stun European minds. Scenes of war, of kings, of gods, etched in metal and bone. This was not primitive. This was a record of memory, a chronicle of power. The Oba was supreme, but not alone. Councils, guilds, spiritual advisors, all contributed to governance. Benin was spiritual, diplomatic, and proud. It traded with other African kingdoms and cautiously with Europeans. It maintained its culture while engaging the world. But in 1897, Britain invaded. They looted, burned, destroyed, thousands of bronzes stolen, many still displayed in European museums. But the soul of Benin survives, in stories, in blood, in pride. And now to our final chapter, to the Songhai Empire, Mali's successor in the greatest empire West Africa had ever known. As Mali waned in the 1400s, Songhai rose under Sunni Ali. A master tactician, Sunni Ali conquered Timbuktu and Jenny. He ruled with an iron will, organizing the military, uniting the empire. Sunni Ali wasn't loved by all. Some feared his methods, but no one doubted his strength. After his death in 1492, the same year Columbus crossed the Atlantic, Askia Muhammad rose. Askia wasn't just a ruler. He was a reformer. He standardized currency, restructured administration, expanded trade, and elevated learning. Under Askia, Timbuktu's universities flourished. Law, medicine, astronomy, poetry. Black scholars teaching black students in African cities. Songhai was vast, structured, powerful. By the 1500s, it had eclipsed Mali in size and influence. But Morocco, hungry for gold and power, invaded in the late 1500s. Songhai fell, but its wisdom endured. Remember, when Europe woke from the Dark Ages, Africa was already awake. We had libraries before their printing presses, cities before their maps, civilization before their arrival. Before the chains, there was glory. We've journeyed across time, from the high walls of Zimbabwe to the gold-lined halls of Timbuktu, from the sea-laced ports of Kilwa to the sacred bronzes of Benin. This is Africa. This is legacy. They told us we were nothing but shadows, echoes without origin, people without past. But you've just walked through the living proof that we were architects of time, that long before the world came looking for Africa, Africa had already found herself. From the stone towers of Great Zimbabwe to the coral palaces of Kilwa, from the royal courts of Congo to the bronze-bright legacy of Benin, from the fire-forged rise of Songhai to the wisdom-soaked streets of Timbuktu, you've seen it now. Not hearsay, not myth, but memory carved in stone, inked in scrolls, burned into the bones of history. These were not flickers of greatness, they were flames. flames that lit the continent long before outsiders brought their own fire. And though they tried to bury it, in lies, in silence, in ash, the roots still burn. And from those roots, we rise. Here at Folktales Cinema, we don't just tell stories, we unearth memory, we dust off truth, we reclaim what was scattered and hold it to the light. So let me ask you, which story in this journey lit something in you? Which kingdom, which leader, which vision of Africa do you wish the world saw clearer? Drop it in the comments. Let's talk. Let's remember together. And if this tale stirred something in you, then don't let it stay still. Share it, because someone, somewhere, still believes Africa began with chains. Show them it began with crowns. Like this video if it opened your eyes. Subscribe if you're ready to walk deeper into the past with us. And turn on that notification bell, because every week on Folktales Cinema, we bring you closer to the stories they tried to silence. And we're just getting started. Africa was never waiting to be found. She was always here watching, building, dreaming. And now we remember. Until next time, stay bold, stay curious, and never stop reclaiming the story.